Hey guys, tonight we begin with sacred prostitution in ancient Babylon, because apparently someone thought the best way to honor the gods was through a divine hookup service. Before you get comfortable with that mental image, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And honestly, if you're sticking around for ancient Mesopotamian dating apps, you're definitely kind of weird. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, especially those of you Googling temple prostitutes at 3 a.m. Now dim the lights, maybe. Turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together through one of history's most misunderstood religious practices. Let's start with the biggest misconception about sacred prostitution in ancient Babylon. Most people imagine some kind of ancient Vegas where horny priests ran elaborate brothels disguised as religious ceremonies. In reality, sacred prostitution was a complex religious institution that had about as much in common with modern prostitution as a medieval monastery has with a modern corporation. Think of it less like a red light district and more like a very, very specialized form of prayer, albeit one that would definitely get you kicked out of Sunday school. This wasn't some hedonistic free-for-all where people showed up to worship with their pants already half off. It was a carefully regulated religious practice with specific rules, seasonal timing, and social purposes that make perfect sense within Babylonian culture, even if it makes us snicker like teenagers in health class. The 6th century BCE was peak Babylon time, when this ancient city was basically the New York of Mesopotamia. If New York had ziggurats instead of skyscrapers and worshiped fertility gods instead of money. Well, actually, scratch that second part. Babylon wasn't the quaint little desert town your Sunday school teacher probably described. It was a bustling metropolis of over 200,000 people, complete with traffic jams involving donkey carts and the world's first recorded complaints about city noise ordinances. The temples controlled everything that mattered: the grain supply, the water rights, the calendar, and yes, apparently the dating scene. If you thought modern religious institutions had their fingers in too many pies, Babylonian temples were running the entire bakery. These weren't just places of worship. They were banks, schools, courts, and social centers all rolled into one. The priests didn't just give spiritual guidance. They were economists, astronomers, judges, and apparently matchmakers with a very liberal interpretation of their job description. The goddess Ishtar ruled over love, fertility, and war because nothing says romantic evening like a deity who could either bless your marriage or burn down your city, depending on her mood. If you thought modern dating was complicated, try navigating romance when your patron goddess literally invented the phrase "make love, not war," and then promptly forgot which one she preferred on any given Tuesday. This divine combination of sex and violence wasn't contradictory to the Babylonians. It was Tuesday. Enter Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian who basically invented the travel blog format. Except instead of reviewing restaurants, he was reviewing entire civilizations and their, shall we say, unique customs. Herodotus visited Babylon around 450 BCE and came back with stories that made his fellow Greeks either fascinated or horrified, depending on how wine was involved in the conversation. According to our friendly neighborhood ancient gossip columnist, every Babylonian woman was required to sit in the temple of Ishtar at least once in her lifetime and, well, let's just say, receive a stranger in exchange for money that would be donated to the temple. But here's where it gets comedy gold. Herodotus claims that attractive women could get this religious obligation over with quickly, while less conventionally attractive women might sit there for years waiting for someone to approach them with the required silver coin. Imagine being so unattractive that you couldn't even get lucky in what was essentially a religiously mandated hookup situation. That's not just being unlucky in love. That's being cursed by the gods of romance themselves. Some women allegedly brought packed lunches because they knew it was going to be a long wait. Nothing says sacred religious duty like a bag lunch. And a good book while you wait for divine intervention in your love life. But here's the twist that makes historians argue to this day. Herodotus was basically the ancient equivalent of that friend who comes back from vacation with increasingly unbelievable stories. And if you think that's questionable historical sourcing, wait until you hear about the archaeological evidence that makes this whole story even more complicated. This wasn't just about ancient people having a very different relationship with sexuality and religion than we do today. Sacred prostitution, if it existed as described, represented a fundamental intersection of economics, spirituality, and social control that would make modern megachurch prosperity gospel look like a lemonade stand operation. We're talking about a system where religious devotion, economic transaction, and social obligation all got tangled up in ways that would make even the most liberal theology professor need a drink. The implications rippled through Babylonian society, affecting everything from marriage customs to international trade relations, because apparently nothing says diplomatic relations like comparing notes on religious practices that would make a sailor blush. This mattered then because it represented how a civilization organized some of its most fundamental human experiences. It matters now because historians are still fighting about whether any of this actually happened, or if we've been getting our historical knowledge from the ancient equivalent of a tabloid newspaper. The complexity and contradictions we're about to explore make modern religious debates look like disagreements over pizza toppings. But Herodotus and his possibly exaggerated travel tales were just the beginning. The real story involves archaeological evidence that's more confusing than helpful, religious texts that read like they were written by committee, and modern scholars who can't agree on whether any of this actually happened. Buckle up, the archaeological evidence problem with Babylonian sacred prostitution is like trying to solve a murder mystery, where the only witness is your drunk uncle who swears he saw Bigfoot at the crime scene. Unlike what Herodotus would have you believe, that every woman in Babylon was basically required to have a religiously mandated one-night stand, the actual physical evidence is about as clear as mud mixed with ancient bureaucratic paperwork. Here's where things get historically hilarious. Archaeologists have been digging around Babylon for over a century, finding everything from cuneiform shopping lists to elaborate palace decorations. But when it comes to definitive proof of temple prostitution, crickets, and not even the loud, obvious kind of crickets. We're talking about the awkward, silence kind of crickets that happen when someone asks an uncomfortable question at a family dinner. The historical context for this evidentiary black hole is actually pretty straightforward. Babylonian temples were meticulously documented institutions. These people kept records of everything: grain inventories, tax collections, religious ceremonies, staff schedules, probably even who forgot to clean the altar candles. If sacred prostitution was as widespread and institutionalized as Herodotus claimed, you'd expect to find it mentioned in temple accounts with the same frequency as, say, bought more incense or repaired roof leak. But instead, what we find is a fascinating collection of religious texts, legal codes, and administrative documents that seem to go out of their way to avoid mentioning this supposedly central religious practice. It's like finding a detailed restaurant menu with no prices listed, or a dating app profile with no photos. Technically functional, but missing the information you most want to know. This developed the way it did because ancient historians, bless their hearts, were about as reliable as modern internet reviews. They loved a good story, especially if it involved foreign cultures doing things that would scandalize the folks back home. Herodotus, in particular, had a talent for turning every cultural difference into entertainment that would make reality. TV producers weep with envy. Take the famous Code of Hammurabi, Babylon's answer to ancient legal documentation that was so comprehensive it makes modern tax codes look like grocery lists. This thing covered everything from property disputes to marriage contracts to what happens if your ox gores your neighbor's ox. And trust me, they had very specific opinions about ox-related violence. The code mentions temple women in several contexts, but here's where it gets interesting in that, wait, what? Kind of way. It talks about Natatu women, priestesses, who were often celibate and couldn't inherit property in the same way as other women. It mentions Kadishtu women, who were associated with temples, but whose exact role is about as clear as a politician's. Campaign promise. But nowhere, and I mean nowhere, does it say, and here's the legal framework for temple prostitution, because apparently that's a thing we need to regulate. One specific example that makes historians scratch their heads involves the Esagila temple complex in Babylon. This place was basically the Vatican of ancient Mesopotamia, complete with enough bureaucratic paperwork to choke a ziggurat. We have detailed records of temple staff, religious ceremonies, festival preparations, and budget allocations that would make a modern accountant weep with appreciation for their organizational skills. Among all these records, we find mentions of various female temple personnel, musicians, singers, weavers, food preparers, and ritual specialists. But the job description that's conspicuously missing: sacred prostitute. It's like finding a detailed employee handbook for a major corporation that somehow forgot to mention an entire department that allegedly employed hundreds of people. Another example involves the archaeological site of Mari, where French archaeologists discovered over 25,000 cuneiform tablets, basically the ancient equivalent of finding someone's entire email archive going back decades. These tablets include diplomatic correspondence, economic records, religious texts, and personal letters that give us an incredibly detailed picture of ancient Mesopotamian life. Among all these documents, which include discussions of various religious practices, temple administration, and social customs, references to sacred prostitution are rarer than a unicorn at a logic convention. One tablet allegedly mentions a woman who consecrated herself to Ishtar, but whether this means she became a temple prostitute or simply dedicated her life to religious service is about as clear as ancient Mesopotamian tax policy. The pattern that emerges is fascinatingly frustrating. We have tons of evidence about Babylonian religious life, social customs, legal frameworks, and economic systems. But when it comes to this supposedly widespread practice of sacred prostitution, the evidence becomes slippery as an eel covered in olive oil. Meanwhile, we do have clear evidence of regular, non-sacred prostitution in Babylon, complete with legal protections, taxation records, and regulatory frameworks. The Babylonians were apparently fine with documenting and regulating secular sex work, but were mysteriously silent about its sacred counterpart. It's like finding detailed restaurant health inspection records, but no mention of the alleged food trucks that supposedly operated in the same area. But it wasn't that simple, because nothing in ancient history ever is. The complicating factor that makes this whole debate more twisted than a pretzel at a yoga convention is that absence of evidence isn't necessarily evidence of absence, especially when you're dealing with religious practices that might have been considered too sacred to document in mundane administrative records. Some scholars argue that sacred prostitution might have been so deeply embedded in religious practice that it didn't need to be explicitly mentioned in legal codes, kind of like how modern church bulletins don't usually include detailed instructions on how to pray because everyone already knows. This is the academic equivalent of saying, well, maybe the dog ate all the homework, but that doesn't mean there wasn't homework to begin with. The contradictory evidence comes from other ancient sources who seem to confirm Herodotus' account. But here's where it gets messy. These sources are often later Greek and Roman writers, who were basically playing the ancient equivalent of telephone. Strabo, writing centuries after Herodotus, mentions similar practices, but he's basically citing Herodotus, who might have been citing someone who once knew a guy who visited Babylon. Different perspectives emerge when you consider that what Greeks and Romans might have interpreted as prostitution could have been entirely different religious practices that didn't translate well across cultural boundaries. It's like trying to explain modern Western dating culture to someone from a completely different cultural background. Things get lost in translation, and suddenly holding hands becomes either scandalously intimate or disappointingly platonic. Depending on your frame of reference, the situation becomes more complex. When you realize that Greek writers had their own cultural biases and expectations about what barbarian cultures should be doing. To a Greek audience, stories about exotic foreign religious practices involving sexuality weren't just news, they were entertainment. And entertainment has never been particularly concerned with accuracy. Modern anthropological studies of similar practices in other cultures suggest that what outside observers interpret as prostitution might actually be complex ritual exchanges, fertility ceremonies, or social bonding practices that serve entirely different functions than commercial sex work. The result was a historical game of telephone that lasted over 2 millennia, with each generation of scholars either accepting or rejecting the sacred prostitution narrative, based on whatever academic fashion was trending at the time. Early Christian writers, unsurprisingly, loved the story because it provided excellent material for look how depraved those pagans were. Sermons that could fill a Sunday morning and then some. Medieval scholars, who were mostly monks with limited first-hand experience in either prostitution or ancient Babylon, generally accepted the accounts at face value because they confirmed their existing beliefs about pre-Christian religious practices. Renaissance humanists got excited about anything involving classical sources, so they enthusiastically embraced Herodotus without asking too many inconvenient questions about verification. The 19th century, archaeologists who first started seriously excavating Mesopotamian sites approached the question with Victorian sensibilities that made them simultaneously fascinated and horrified by the possibility of institutionalized sacred sexuality. They dug enthusiastically, hoping to either prove or disprove the accounts, but mostly ended up finding a lot of pottery and not much in the way of ancient sex manuals. Modern feminist scholars have pointed out that the entire narrative conveniently fits into patterns of Orientalist fantasy about exotic Eastern sexuality, which is academics speak for maybe these stories say more about the fantasies of Greek men than they do about Babylonian religious practices. This perspective suggests that sacred prostitution might be less about historical reality and more about ancient cultural stereotyping. Contemporary Assyriologists, the scholars who actually read cuneiform and know what they're talking about, when it comes to ancient Mesopotamia, are split into camps that approach the question with the kind of academic passion usually reserved for sports rivalries. Some argue that the silence in the archaeological record is significant and suggests the whole thing was a Greek fabrication. Others contend that religious practices often leave minimal archaeological traces and that we shouldn't expect to find explicit documentation. The institutional reactions have been equally divided. Museums have struggled with how to present the topic, trying to balance historical accuracy with public interest in what is, let's be honest, a pretty sensational subject. Academic conferences have featured heated debates that make congressional hearings look like polite tea parties. The long-term implications of this scholarly disagreement extend beyond just ancient history. The sacred prostitution debate has become a case study in how historical narratives get constructed challenged, and reconstructed over time. It's also become a cautionary tale about accepting ancient sources at face value, especially when those sources are describing practices that are exotic or shocking to the author's own cultural background. Meanwhile, while scholars continue to argue about whether sacred prostitution ever existed in the way Herodotus described, there's another angle to this story that's equally fascinating and considerably more verifiable: the role of women in Babylonian temples and how their actual documented responsibilities, compared to the sensationalized accounts we've inherited from Greek sources. The connection to our previous discussion about evidence becomes clear when you realize that Babylonian temples employed hundreds of women in various capacities that we can actually document through archaeological evidence. These weren't mysterious figures engaging in vaguely defined religious practices. They were administrators, musicians, textile workers, ritual specialists, and economic managers who kept detailed records of their activities. This documented reality of women's roles in Babylonian religious institutions provides a much more complex and interesting picture than the simplified narrative of temple prostitution. It also raises fascinating questions about how religious, economic, and social functions intersected in ways that might have been misunderstood or misrepresented by outside observers who didn't fully grasp the cultural context of what they were. Witnessing the build-up of anticipation for our next section comes from realizing that the real story of women in Babylonian temples might be far more revolutionary and historically significant than the sensationalized accounts that have dominated popular understanding for centuries. We're about to dive into what these women actually did, how they wielded power and influence, and why their true roles might have been deliberately obscured or misunderstood by ancient and modern sources alike. If the alleged sacred prostitution was basically the ancient equivalent of a tabloid headline, then the actual roles of women in Babylonian temples were more like the business section of a major newspaper, way more important, infinitely more complex, and tragically less likely to get people's attention at parties. The reality of women's temple roles was far more revolutionary than any sensationalized sex story could ever be. Unlike the mysterious, vaguely defined sacred prostitutes that may or may not have existed, real Babylonian temple women left behind a paper trail that would make a modern forensic accountant weep with joy. We're talking about detailed employment records, salary documentation, property ownership papers, and business correspondence that spanned centuries. These weren't shadowy figures engaging in ritualistic activities. They were CEOs, CFOs, and department heads running some of the most powerful economic institutions in the ancient world. The context for this institutional female power becomes important when you realize that Babylonian temples weren't just religious centers. They were the ancient equivalent of multinational corporations, complete with agricultural holdings, manufacturing operations, international trade networks, and banking services. The priests might have been the public face of these operations. The women were often the ones actually running the show behind the scenes. This became important and relevant because temple women wielded economic power that would make modern corporate executives jealous. They controlled vast agricultural estates, managed international trade relationships, oversaw manufacturing operations, and administered loan programs that could make or break entire communities. Some of these women accumulated personal wealth that exceeded that of many kings, and they did it all while technically being religious personnel. The irony is delicious. While Greek writers were obsessing over alleged temple prostitution, they completely missed the real story, which was that Babylonian women had figured out how to use religious institutions as a pathway to economic and social power in ways that wouldn't be matched in the Western world for another couple of thousand years. It's like focusing on the scandals in a corporate boardroom while completely ignoring that half the board members happen to be running a shadow empire that controls the global economy. Consider the fascinating case of Amat Marduk, a Natatu priestess from the 18th century BCE, whose business records read like a masterclass in ancient venture capitalism. This woman didn't just serve in the temple. She basically ran a financial empire that would make Gordon Gekko look like an amateur playing with lunch money. Amat Marduk's cuneiform business correspondence, discovered in the archives of Sippar, reveals a woman who simultaneously managed temple properties, operated multiple rental businesses, administered agricultural loans, and somehow found time to engage in international trade that stretched from Anatolia to the Persian Gulf. Her property holdings included houses, fields, gardens, and commercial buildings throughout the city. She wasn't just wealthy, she was buy-your-own-ziggurat wealthy. The background to her success involves understanding that Natatu priestesses, while technically celibate, were allowed to own property and conduct business in ways that married women often couldn't. It was like finding a loophole in the ancient patriarchal system and then driving a chariot full of silver through it. These women couldn't have children, but they can have empires. What happened next in Amat Marduk's story is where it gets really interesting. She didn't just accumulate wealth for its own sake. She used her economic power to influence temple policy, support other women in similar positions, and essentially create a network of financially independent female religious personnel who answered to no man except technically their gods, and even then, they seemed to be on pretty equal footing during negotiations. The key players in her network included other Natatu women who collectively owned so much property in Sippar that they essentially controlled the local real estate market. Imagine a group of nuns who somehow ended up owning Manhattan. And you're getting close to the level of economic influence these women wielded. Another major example involves the temple women of yore, whose records show them operating what was essentially an ancient textile manufacturing corporation. These women managed everything from sheep breeding operations to finished cloth exports, employing hundreds of workers and maintaining quality control standards that would impress modern factory managers. The drama and conflict in their story comes from dealing with male temple officials who occasionally tried to assert control over these women's operations, usually with results that can best be described as adorably unsuccessful. One particular cuneiform tablet records a dispute where temple women basically told a male administrator to stick to his own job and leave the actual business operations to people who knew what they were doing. The resolution involved the women keeping their autonomy, and the male official presumably learning to mind his own business. But perhaps the most remarkable case study involves Shala Marduk, a Kadishta woman from 6th century BCE Babylon whose business records indicate she was running what amounted to an ancient private banking operation. She provided loans to merchants, farmers, and craftsmen, charging interest rates that were regulated by royal decree, but still profitable enough to make her one of the wealthiest individuals in the city. The human elements of her story emerge from personal letters found in her archive, which reveal a woman who genuinely cared about her clients' success while also being sharp enough to protect her investments. She wrote detailed advice to borrowers about crop management, offered extended payment terms during difficult harvests, and occasionally forgave debts entirely when borrowers faced genuine hardship. It's like finding out that your loan shark also moonlighted as a financial advisor and life coach. The broader significance of these women's stories lies in understanding that they weren't exceptional cases. They were representative of a systematic approach to female economic empowerment that used religious institutions as a vehicle for business success. Temple women across Mesopotamia were running similar operations, creating networks of mutual support, and accumulating wealth and influence that allowed them to operate as independent economic agents in a society that theoretically limited women's rights in such matters. This wasn't isolated to a few exceptional women making the most of unusual circumstances. The pattern of economically powerful temple women appears consistently across different cities, time periods, and social contexts throughout Mesopotamian history, suggesting a systematic approach to female economic empowerment that was built into the religious institutional structure itself. Other examples include the temple women of Uruk, who controlled agricultural operations so extensive that their harvest records read like modern commodity trading reports. In Mari, temple women managed diplomatic correspondence and gift exchanges with foreign courts, essentially serving as international relations specialists. At Kanish, temple women operated trading posts that connected Mesopotamian markets with Anatolian suppliers, managing complex financial instruments that wouldn't look out of place in a modern, international business textbook. The pattern explanation reveals that Babylonian society had essentially created a parallel economic system where women could accumulate and wield power through religious service. While secular women faced various legal and social restrictions on their economic activities, temple women operated under different rules that allowed them unprecedented freedom to own property, conduct business, and make independent financial decisions. This pattern existed because temple women filled crucial economic roles that required the kind of long-term stability and institutional loyalty that celibate religious personnel could provide. Unlike male priests who might be distracted by family obligations or political ambitions, temple women often devoted their entire lives to institutional success, making them ideal candidates for managing complex, long-term economic operations. The social, political, and economic factors that supported this system included the need for temple institutions to maintain financial independence from royal control, the requirement for trustworthy personnel to manage valuable assets, and the recognition that women's social networks and relationship-building skills made them particularly effective at certain types of business operations. Comparison to other time periods reveals just how remarkable this system was. While medieval European nuns occasionally accumulated wealth and influence, they operated within much more restrictive frameworks that limited their economic activities. Roman women could own property, but faced significant legal restrictions on business operations. The level of economic freedom and institutional power wielded by Babylonian temple women wouldn't be matched in the Western world until well into the modern era. And even then, it took specific legal and social changes to create similar opportunities. The effects were nothing short of revolutionary for women's economic status in the ancient world. Temple women didn't just benefit individually from this system, they created a model of female economic empowerment that influenced broader social attitudes about women's capabilities and rights in ways that rippled through Mesopotamian society for centuries. Who benefited most obviously were the temple women themselves, who achieved levels of wealth, independence, and social influence that would have been impossible through traditional marriage and family structures. But the benefits extended far beyond individual success stories. The economic activities of temple women created employment opportunities for other women, provided financial services to entire communities, and demonstrated that female-managed enterprises could be as successful as any male-dominated business operation. The communities that housed these temple complexes benefited enormously from having access to well-managed financial institutions, agricultural operations, and manufacturing centers that provided economic stability and growth opportunities. Temple women's lending operations often kept local economies afloat during difficult periods, while their agricultural management helped ensure food security. Who suffered, if anyone, were probably the male economic elites who found themselves competing with institutions that had both divine sanction and impressive business acumen. Some royal officials occasionally tried to assert control over temple women's operations, usually with limited success because these women had both economic power and religious protection working in their favor. The unintended consequences included creating a class of women who were economically independent enough to influence political decisions, support other women's advancement, and challenge traditional gender roles in ways that made some people deeply uncomfortable. Temple women occasionally used their wealth to support female relatives, fund other women's business ventures, and create networks of mutual support that operated largely outside male control. How this shaped future developments becomes clear when you realize that the economic models developed by temple women influenced later Mesopotamian business practices, contributed to the sophistication of ancient banking systems, and demonstrated organizational techniques that would be adopted by secular institutions. The administrative methods developed in temple complexes managed by women became standard practices throughout the ancient Near East. Modern parallels are striking when you consider that these ancient temple women essentially created the world's first systematic approach to using religious institutions as a pathway to female economic empowerment. Contemporary examples of women using educational institutions, nonprofit organizations, and religious frameworks to build economic power and social influence follow similar patterns, suggesting that the strategies developed by Babylonian temple women remain relevant today. The lessons from their success include understanding that institutional frameworks can provide protection and legitimacy for challenging traditional power structures, that economic independence often requires finding alternative pathways around existing restrictions, and that women's business networks can be particularly effective at creating sustainable economic opportunities that benefit entire communities rather than just individual entrepreneurs. Yet even as temple women were building these impressive economic empires and redefining what religious service could accomplish, the popular imagination, both ancient and modern, remained fixated on the much more salacious but probably fictional narrative of sacred prostitution. This disconnect between reality and reputation was already becoming a problem during the classical period, when Greek and Roman writers were spreading stories that had little basis in the documented experiences of actual temple women. The transition to our next major element involves understanding that this reputation problem wasn't just a matter of historical accuracy. It had real consequences for how temple women were perceived and treated by outsiders. And it ultimately contributed to the decline of these institutions as political and cultural changes made their economic independence increasingly difficult to maintain. Meanwhile, as temple women were reaching the peak of their economic influence, during the Neo-Babylonian period, political developments were already in motion that would fundamentally challenge their ability to operate independently. The Persian conquest of Babylon, changing religious attitudes, and new administrative systems all combined to create pressures that would ultimately transform or eliminate the institutional frameworks that had allowed these women to accumulate such remarkable power and influence. The build-up to our next section involves understanding that the peak of temple women's success contained the seeds of its own transformation, as external political changes and internal institutional evolution combined to create crisis conditions that would test whether these economic empires could survive fundamental changes to the society that had created them. By 539 BCE, the economic empire that temple women had spent centuries building was about to collide headfirst with a Persian invasion that would make their previous business challenges look like minor accounting discrepancies. The situation had reached a breaking point where centuries of female economic independence were suddenly facing an existential threat from conquerors who had very different ideas about how religious institutions should operate. The description of tensions and problems reads like a corporate thriller where the protagonists suddenly discover that their entire industry is about to be revolutionized by hostile takeover specialists who don't understand the business model and aren't particularly interested in learning. Cyrus the Great wasn't just conquering territories. He was implementing a completely different approach to religious administration that would fundamentally challenge everything temple women had built. The key players involved included not just Cyrus and his Persian administrators, but also the Babylonian temple women who suddenly found themselves needing to navigate a political transformation that threatened to eliminate their institutional autonomy. These weren't just religious personnel facing new management. They were business executives watching their entire economic framework get dismantled by people who viewed temples as purely spiritual institutions rather than the complex economic powerhouses they had become. The stakes involved were nothing less than the survival of the most successful experiment in female economic empowerment the ancient world had ever seen. We're talking about institutional networks that controlled vast agricultural holdings, international trade relationships, manufacturing operations, and banking services that employed thousands of people and generated wealth that rivaled royal treasuries. Temple women like Idi Marduk Balatu of Sippar weren't just facing career changes. They were watching an entire way of life disappear as Persian administrators implemented new policies that would centralize temple administration under royal control, eliminate many traditional autonomies, and fundamentally alter the relationship between religious service and economic activity. The crisis wasn't just political or economic. It was cultural, representing a collision between a society that had evolved sophisticated methods for integrating women into positions of real power and a conquering empire that operated under very different assumptions about gender roles, religious functions, and institutional organization. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of a tech startup with revolutionary business practices, getting acquired by a traditional corporation that wants to normalize operations according to conventional industry standards. The moment that crystallized this crisis came in 539 BCE, when Cyrus's armies marched into Babylon without a fight. But the real drama unfolded in the months that followed as Persian administrators began implementing what they called religious reforms. But what temple women experienced as systematic dismantling of their economic independence. The build-up to this confrontation had been developing for years as Nabonidus, the last Babylonian king, had already been alienating the temple establishment through his religious innovations and absence from traditional ceremonies. Temple women had watched their political protections weaken as royal support for traditional religious practices declined, but nothing had prepared them for the wholesale administrative revolution that the Persians brought with them. The key moments of this transformation read like a slow-motion corporate restructuring designed by people who fundamentally misunderstood what they were restructuring. Persian administrators, coming from a religious tradition that viewed temples primarily as places of worship rather than economic institutions, began implementing policies that separated religious functions from business operations with all the cultural sensitivity of a bull in a pottery shop. One particularly dramatic scene involved the temple complex at Sippar, where Persian officials arrived to conduct what they called an administrative review of temple operations. The temple women, led by a Neditu named Amat Sin, who had been managing the institution's agricultural holdings for over 2 decades, presented detailed records of their economic activities, property holdings, and business relationships that demonstrated the sophisticated financial empire they had built. The dialogue, reconstructed from administrative records and correspondence, reveals a clash between 2 completely different worldviews. The Persian officials, according to cuneiform tablets from the period, expressed confusion about why religious personnel were engaged in secular activities like property management, international trade, and banking operations. Amat Sin and her colleagues apparently tried to explain that these activities weren't separate from their religious duties. They were integral to their conception of divine service. The play-by-play of important scenes shows Persian administrators systematically questioning every aspect of temple women's economic activities. They wanted to know why celibate priestesses owned vast agricultural estates, why temple personnel were engaged in international commerce, and why religious institutions operated what appeared to be independent banking systems. The temple women's explanations that these activities were traditional and necessary for temple independence fell on ears that were culturally deaf to such arguments. Character motivations become clear from the surviving correspondence. The Persian administrators weren't deliberately trying to destroy women's economic power. They were implementing a standardized approach to religious administration that had worked in other conquered territories. They viewed themselves as reformers bringing rational organization to chaotic local customs. The temple women, meanwhile, weren't just defending their personal wealth, they were fighting to preserve institutional autonomy that had taken centuries to develop. The unexpected developments came when some temple women attempted to work within the new system by demonstrating that their economic activities actually benefited the Persian state through increased tax revenues and improved regional stability. Several women submitted detailed proposals showing how their operations could be integrated into Persian administrative structures while maintaining their essential character. The climax of this bureaucratic drama occurred when Cyrus himself was presented with competing reports about temple administration. Persian officials recommended centralizing all temple economic activities under royal control, while Babylonian advisors, including some influential temple women, argued that the existing system was more efficient and profitable for the state if left largely unchanged. The immediate aftermath of these negotiations established a compromise that satisfied no one completely. Temple women could continue their economic activities, but under increased Persian oversight and with new restrictions on property acquisitions and international trade. Some of the most successful women, like Amat Sin, managed to maintain their operations by accepting Persian business partners and adapting their methods to new administrative requirements. The other temple women found their activities severely curtailed or eliminated entirely, as Persian officials implemented policies that prioritized standardization over local autonomy. The textile operations at Ur were consolidated under royal management, while many of the independent banking operations were absorbed into Persian state. Financial institutions dot the personal drama of individual women losing economic empires they had spent decades building provides the human interest angle that makes this administrative revolution emotionally resonant. These weren't abstract policy changes. They were life-altering transformations that forced successful businesswomen to either adapt to fundamentally different operating conditions or watch their life's work disappear into Persian bureaucratic structures that had no appreciation for what they had accomplished. The response was about as unified as a committee trying to decide on lunch, which is to say, everyone had strong opinions, most of them contradictory, and nobody was entirely happy with the final outcome. Various parties' reactions to the Persian administrative revolution revealed the complex web of interests that had developed around temple women's economic activities over the centuries. The immediate consequences for temple women themselves range from complete adaptation to total elimination, depending on their individual circumstances, political connections, and willingness to work within Persian administrative frameworks. Some women, particularly those with the most extensive international business relationships, successfully repositioned themselves as Persian-approved economic agents and continued operating with modified autonomy. The political fallout extended beyond just temple administration into broader questions about Babylonian cultural autonomy under Persian rule. Traditional Babylonian elites found themselves caught between supporting familiar institutions and demonstrating loyalty to their new rulers, leading to political calculations that would make modern diplomats dizzy with their complexity. Royal officials who had previously benefited from relationships with economically powerful temple women suddenly found themselves needing to renegotiate these connections through Persian administrative channels. Some adapted by becoming intermediaries between temple women and Persian authorities, while others abandoned these relationships entirely in favor of cultivating connections with Persian administrators. How this changed everything becomes clear when you examine the long-term effects on women's economic opportunities throughout the Persian Empire. The Babylonian model of temple-based female economic empowerment didn't spread to other Persian territories. Instead, it was gradually normalized according to Persian administrative standards that prioritize centralized control over local autonomy. What it changed nothing about was the fundamental human desire for economic independence and social influence, which meant that enterprising women throughout the Persian period continued finding ways to accumulate wealth and power just through different institutional frameworks and with different strategies that worked within Persian cultural expectations. The ironic outcomes included the fact that Persian administrative efficiency, while limiting temple women's autonomy, actually improved record-keeping practices that provide modern historians with much better documentation of women's economic activities during this period. We know more about how temple women adapted to Persian rule than we do about how they operated during the height of their independence, simply because Persian bureaucrats loved paperwork even more than Babylonians did. Another unintended consequence involved the preservation of Babylonian economic practices through their integration into Persian administrative systems. Many of the business methods developed by temple women became standard practices throughout the Persian Empire, spreading their innovations far beyond their original Mesopotamian context. The most significant long-term consequence was the establishment of a precedent for how conquering empires would handle local religious institutions that had evolved complex economic functions. The Persian approach of gradual integration rather than immediate elimination became a model for later imperial administrations dealing with similar situations, though whether this was better or worse for the people involved depends largely on your perspective about cultural autonomy versus administrative efficiency. This administrative revolution wasn't just about Persian conquerors reorganizing Babylonian religious institutions. It represented a fundamental shift in how political power related to religious autonomy, economic independence, and gender roles that would influence imperial administration for centuries to come. The deeper meaning of these changes lies in understanding that the Persian conquest marked the end of a unique historical moment when local religious institutions could operate with sufficient independence to create alternative pathways to economic and social power. The integration of Babylonian temples into Persian administrative structures eliminated the institutional autonomy that had made temple women's economic empires possible in the first place. What this revealed about the system was that female economic empowerment in the ancient world was much more dependent on specific institutional frameworks and political arrangements than anyone had realized. The success of temple women hadn't just been about individual capabilities or cultural attitudes. It had required a particular combination of religious authority, political independence, and economic opportunity that proved fragile when confronted with imperial standardization. The long-term effects extended far beyond Babylon into questions about how imperial administrations should handle local institutions that don't fit standard administrative categories. The Persian approach of gradual integration became a template for later empires, but it also established the principle that local autonomy would ultimately be subordinated to imperial administrative efficiency. Why historians still debate this transformation involves questions about whether the Persian changes represented progress toward more rational and efficient administration, or cultural imperialism that destroyed valuable local innovations. Modern scholars argue about whether temple women's economic activities were sustainable in the long term, or whether they represented an unsustainable concentration of wealth and power that needed reform. The contemporary relevance appears in modern discussions about cultural preservation versus administrative modernization, the relationship between religious institutions and economic activity, and the ways that political changes can eliminate hard-won advances in gender equality. The temple women of Babylon had created something remarkable that took centuries to develop and was dismantled in a matter of decades, raising questions about how societies can protect innovative approaches to social organization from being eliminated by well-meaning but culturally insensitive administrative reforms. The Persian period marked the beginning of the end for temple women's economic independence, but it also marked the beginning of a new phase in their story: adaptation, resistance, and the search for alternative strategies that could preserve some version of their achievements within fundamentally changed circumstances. Around the main drama of temple women losing their economic empires to Persian administrative efficiency, a fascinating cast of supporting characters played crucial roles that ranged from hilariously incompetent to tragically heroic, often within the same person on the same day. Gubaru, the Persian governor appointed to oversee Babylonian temple administration, was essentially a well-meaning bureaucrat trying to apply standardized imperial policies to a situation that defied every category in his administrative handbook. His correspondence, preserved in the Moroku archive, reveals a man who spent most of his time writing increasingly confused reports to his superiors about why Babylonian temples operated like multinational corporations and why celibate priestesses owned more property than most Persian nobles. Gubaru's story becomes endearing in that watching your dad try to use a smartphone kind of way when you read his attempts to categorize temple women's activities according to Persian administrative standards. He wrote detailed memoranda trying to explain to Persian headquarters why religious personnel were engaged in international grain trading, textile manufacturing, and banking operations. His reports include phrases like, "The priestesses appear to be operating what can only be described as a commercial enterprise of considerable sophistication," and, "I am uncertain whether these women are religious figures who happen to be excellent, business people or business people who happen to be religious." The significance of Gubaru's confusion lies in understanding that he wasn't stupid. He was applying a rational administrative framework to a cultural situation that his framework couldn't accommodate. His eventual solution was to create new administrative categories that essentially allowed temple women to continue their economic activities under Persian oversight, demonstrating the kind of bureaucratic creativity that would make modern civil servants weep with admiration. Selim Marduk represented a completely different aspect of this cultural transition. He was a Babylonian priest who saw the Persian conquest as an opportunity to eliminate what he viewed as inappropriate female influence in temple administration. His story shows how external political changes can empower internal critics who had previously been marginalized by existing power structures. Selim Marduk's correspondence reveals a man who had spent decades being professionally frustrated by the economic success of his female colleagues. He wrote extensively to Persian administrators, arguing that temple women's business activities were contrary to proper religious practice, and offering to help reorganize temple administration according to traditional principles that would eliminate female economic autonomy. The contribution of Selim Marduk to the narrative involves understanding that the Persian administrative revolution didn't just impose external changes, it also empowered internal opposition that had existed all along but lacked political support. His efforts to convince Persian officials that temple women's activities were somehow illegitimate or inappropriate represent the ancient equivalent of weaponizing regime change to settle old scores. But perhaps the most fascinating character in this supporting cast was Inez Agil Ramat, a temple woman who decided that if the old system was being dismantled, she would create an entirely new system that worked within Persian administrative structures while preserving as much female economic independence as possible. Inez Agil Ramat's approach was pure entrepreneurial genius disguised as religious compliance. She established what was technically a prayer circle for Persian officials, wives that functioned as an exclusive women's business network, complete with investment opportunities, trade connections, and financial services that operated under the radar of Persian administrative oversight because they were technically social and religious activities rather than commercial enterprises. Her different angle was recognizing that Persian culture had its own traditions of elite women's economic activities that could be leveraged to create space for Babylonian women's continued business operations. By framing her activities in terms that Persian wives could understand and participate in, she essentially created a cultural bridge that allowed some version of temple women's economic traditions to survive within the new political framework. The contribution of her story to our broader narrative involves understanding that adaptation doesn't always mean surrender. Sometimes it means finding creative ways to preserve essential elements of what you're trying to protect while appearing to comply with new requirements. Inez Agil Ramat's success demonstrated that cultural survival often requires innovative thinking about how to repackage traditional practices and forms that new political systems can accept. These weren't isolated incidents of individual people trying to navigate political change. They were interconnected stories that reveal the complex web of relationships, rivalries, and collaborations that developed as Babylonian and Persian cultures attempted to accommodate each other's expectations and assumptions. How these stories connect becomes clear when you realize that Dubaru's administrative confusion created opportunities that both Selim Marduk and Inez Agil Ramat exploited, albeit in completely opposite directions. Dubaru's uncertainty about how to categorize temple women's activities meant that creative people could influence his decisions by providing compelling interpretations of what was happening and what should be done about it. The webs of relationships that developed during this transition period reveal how political change creates both winners and losers, but often in ways that nobody anticipated. Selim Marduk's efforts to eliminate female economic influence initially appeared successful when Persian administrators began implementing policies that restricted women's business activities. However, these same restrictions created the conditions that made Inez Agil Ramat's alternative approach not just possible but necessary for women who wanted to maintain economic independence. Political and social networks that emerged during this period included unlikely alliances between Persian officials' wives and Babylonian temple women, business partnerships between Babylonian merchants and Persian administrators, and collaborative relationships between local religious leaders and imperial bureaucrats that crossed cultural and linguistic boundaries in ways that would have been impossible before the conquest. How one event led to another demonstrates the unintended consequences of well-intentioned policies implemented by people who didn't fully understand the systems they were trying to reform. Dubaru's attempts to rationalize temple administration according to Persian standards inadvertently created legal loopholes that enterprising women could exploit to maintain economic activities under different organizational structures. The unintended consequences and connections include the development of new forms of women's economic cooperation that combined Babylonian business methods with Persian social structures, creating hybrid institutions that were more resilient to political change than either purely Babylonian or purely Persian approaches would have been. For example, when Persian administrators restricted temple women's ability to own agricultural property directly, Some women formed partnerships with Persian military veterans who were entitled to land grants, creating joint ventures that allowed women to continue managing agricultural operations while providing Persian partners with income from properties. They didn't have the expertise to manage themselves. These arrangements led to cultural exchanges that influenced both Babylonian and Persian practices in unexpected ways. Persian women learned Babylonian accounting methods and business practices, while Babylonian women adopted Persian approaches to legal documentation and contract negotiation. The result was a syncretic business culture that combined the best elements of both traditions while creating new opportunities for female economic participation. The most fascinating interconnection involves the way that individual adaptation strategies became templates for broader cultural accommodation. Ancestral Ramad's success in creating Persian-compatible women's business networks inspired similar efforts throughout the empire, leading to the development of informal economic institutions that operated parallel to official administrative structures. These parallel institutions became particularly important for preserving elements of Babylonian culture that didn't fit Persian administrative categories. Women's business networks maintained traditional craft techniques, preserved local commercial relationships, and created informal education systems that transmitted business knowledge across generations in ways that formal Persian educational institutions couldn't or wouldn't support. The ripple effects of these interconnected adaptations extended far beyond immediate economic concerns into broader questions about cultural preservation, gender roles, and the relationship between local autonomy and imperial integration. The success of hybrid institutions demonstrated that cultural accommodation didn't require complete assimilation. It was possible to create new forms of organization that preserved essential elements of local traditions while operating within imperial frameworks. This web of interconnected stories ultimately reveals that historical change rarely happens through simple replacement of old systems with new ones. Instead, it involves complex processes of negotiation, adaptation, and creative problem-solving that produce hybrid outcomes that nobody initially anticipated, but that often prove more resilient and sustainable than either the original systems or the intended replacements. To understand how these various characters could navigate such a complex transition, you have to understand the daily realities of living in a multicultural empire where Babylonian, Persian, and various other cultural traditions were suddenly expected to coexist within the same administrative and social frameworks. Daily life in Persian-controlled Babylon involved constant cultural translation between different assumptions about everything from business practices to religious obligations to gender roles. A typical day for someone like Ancestral Ramat might involve conducting temple rituals according to traditional Babylonian practices in the morning, attending administrative meetings conducted in Aramaic using Persian bureaucratic procedures in the afternoon, and hosting dinner parties where Persian officials' wives learned Babylonian accounting methods while Babylonian women discussed Persian legal innovations. The beliefs and attitudes that shaped these interactions included Persian assumptions that religious institutions should focus primarily on spiritual rather than economic activities, Babylonian convictions that economic success was a form of divine service, and pragmatic recognition from both cultures that accommodation was necessary for peaceful coexistence. Social structures during this period became remarkably fluid as traditional Babylonian hierarchies based on temple affiliation and property ownership intersected with Persian hierarchies based on imperial administrative rank and military service. The result was a complex social landscape where a celibate Babylonian priestess might outrank a Persian military officer economically while being subordinate to him administratively, leading to social interactions that required constant negotiation about precedence, protocol, and mutual respect. What was normal versus exceptional during this transition period reveals how quickly human societies can adapt to dramatic change when survival depends on flexibility. Within a generation, it became normal for Persian and Babylonian women to collaborate in business ventures that would have been impossible under either purely Persian or purely Babylonian cultural frameworks. Bilingual business correspondence became standard, as did legal contracts that incorporated elements from both Persian and Babylonian legal traditions. The exceptional elements that emerged during this period included new forms of artistic expression that combined Persian and Babylonian motifs, architectural innovations that blended imperial and local styles, and social customs that allowed people from different cultural backgrounds to interact in ways that preserved dignity and cultural identity, while enabling practical cooperation. How this cultural context shaped events becomes clear when you realize that the success or failure of individual adaptation strategies often depended on how well people could navigate these complex multicultural social dynamics. Those who could speak multiple languages, understand different legal systems, and build relationships across cultural boundaries were much more likely to thrive during this transition than those who remained committed to purely traditional approaches. The cultural fluidity of this period also created opportunities for innovation that wouldn't have existed under either pure Babylonian or pure Persian cultural systems. The hybrid institutions that emerged combined the entrepreneurial flexibility of Babylonian business culture with the organizational efficiency of Persian administrative methods, creating new models for economic and social organization that influenced imperial development for centuries. Perhaps most delicious was the ironic situation that while Greek writers were busy spreading scandalous stories about Babylonian temple prostitution, the actual temple women were running sophisticated business empires that would have made Greek merchants weep with envy, and Persian administrators were struggling to understand economic institutions that were more advanced than anything in their own empire. Examples of contradictions abound in the historical record. Persian officials who came from a culture that theoretically valued administrative efficiency above all else found themselves constantly confused by Babylonian institutions that were actually more efficient than Persian alternatives. Meanwhile, Babylonian traditionalists who complained about foreign influence conveniently ignored the fact that Persian administrative methods often made their own business operations more profitable and legally secure. How things weren't what they seemed becomes particularly apparent when you examine the relationship between religious devotion and economic success in Babylonian culture. What Persian administrators initially interpreted as evidence of corrupt religious practices, priests engaging in commercial activities, was actually evidence of how successfully Babylonian culture had integrated spiritual and economic values in ways that Persian dualistic thinking couldn't accommodate. The contradiction between reputation and reality reached its peak when some Persian officials began recommending that other parts of the empire adopt Babylonian temple administration methods because they were so economically successful, completely missing the irony that they were praising the same institutions they had initially tried to reform for being insufficiently religious. Modern parallels to these contradictions appear in contemporary situations where cultural stereotypes prevent people from recognizing successful innovations that don't fit their preconceived categories. Just as Persian administrators couldn't initially see that temple women's business activities were actually examples of excellent institutional management rather than evidence of religious corruption, modern observers often miss successful alternative approaches to social and economic organization because they don't match conventional expectations. The ultimate irony involves the historical legacy of this entire period. While the sensationalized Greek accounts of temple prostitution continued to dominate popular understanding of Babylonian religion for over 2 millennia, The actual achievements of temple women: creating sustainable institutions for female economic empowerment, developing innovative business practices, and successfully adapting to imperial conquest while preserving cultural autonomy, were largely forgotten until modern archaeological research began revealing the documentary evidence that tells their real story. Perhaps the most contemporary parallel involves how often the most innovative and successful approaches to complex social problems are overlooked, because they don't match conventional assumptions about how things should work, while sensationalized but inaccurate narratives continue to dominate public understanding because they're more entertaining than complicated realities. Everything changed when Dynasty decided that the Persian Empire needed standardized religious policies that actually made sense, which unfortunately meant figuring out what to do with Babylonian temple women who had somehow managed to become more economically successful under Persian rule than they had been under Babylonian independence. The background to this change reads like a bureaucratic comedy where the solution to every problem created 3 new problems that nobody had anticipated. The turning point event occurred around 518 BCE, when Darius commissioned a comprehensive review of temple administration throughout the empire, ostensibly to improve efficiency, but actually because Persian treasury officials had noticed that Babylonian temples were generating tax revenues that made other imperial institutions look like lemonade stands, operated by particularly unambitious children. Why this moment was different from previous administrative adjustments becomes clear when you understand that Darius wasn't just trying to reform Babylonian institutions. He was trying to create empire-wide policies that could accommodate the cultural diversity of his territories while maintaining imperial unity. This was like trying to design a universal remote control that could operate every entertainment system ever invented, including several that hadn't been invented yet. The key factors that led to this transformation included the growing influence of successful hybrid institutions that had emerged during the initial period of Persian-Babylonian cultural accommodation, the increasing complexity of managing multicultural imperial administration, and the recognition that some local innovations were actually superior to imperial standard practices. Persian officials had spent nearly 2 decades trying to understand why Babylonian temple women were so economically successful, and they had finally reached the conclusion that maybe they should stop trying to fix something that obviously wasn't broken. This represented a fundamental shift in imperial policy from standardization through cultural assimilation to standardization through systematic accommodation of effective local practices. The bureaucratic creativity required for this shift involved developing new administrative categories that could accommodate institutions that didn't fit existing Persian frameworks without creating precedents that would undermine imperial authority elsewhere. It was like solving a Rubik's Cube, where each color represented a different cultural tradition, and the goal was alignment without uniformity. Darius's solution was characteristically Persian in its administrative elegance and characteristically pragmatic in its recognition that sometimes the best way to control something is to officially approve what's already happening while claiming credit for the innovation. He essentially created a new imperial policy framework that allowed successful local institutions to operate with expanded autonomy in exchange for increased integration into imperial administrative and economic systems. This policy shift marked the moment when temple women's economic activities transformed from anomalous local customs that confused Persian administrators into officially recognized imperial institutions that other territories were encouraged to emulate. The irony was delicious. Practices that had initially been viewed as evidence of Babylonian religious corruption were now being promoted as examples of imperial innovation and economic development. The transformation represented more than just administrative accommodation. It marked the emergence of a new model for imperial governance that recognized cultural diversity as a source of institutional strength, rather than a problem to be solved through standardization. This approach would influence Persian imperial policy for the remainder of the empire's existence and establish precedents for how later empires would handle similar challenges. How this change unfolded reads like a masterclass in bureaucratic jujitsu, where the Persian Empire essentially decided that if you can't beat them, join them, rebrand their success as imperial innovation, and then take credit for having the wisdom to recognize excellence when you see it. The resistance to change came primarily from Persian traditionalists, who argued that allowing local institutions to operate with expanded autonomy would undermine imperial authority and create dangerous precedents for other territories with inconvenient local customs. These officials preferred the clarity of standardized policies over the complexity of accommodating cultural diversity, even when standardization was less effective than local innovations. The champions of change included not just successful temple women like ancestral Ramat, but also Persian administrators like Guburu, who had discovered that working with local institutions rather than against them produced better results with less effort. These pragmatic officials had learned through experience that fighting cultural differences was exhausting and often counterproductive, while channeling them toward imperial goals was much more efficient. The specific steps and stages of this transformation began with pilot programs in selected Babylonian cities, where temple women's institutions were officially integrated into Persian administrative structures while maintaining their essential operational autonomy. These pilot programs were designed to test whether successful local practices could be scaled up to serve imperial objectives without losing their effectiveness. The obstacles encountered during this process included linguistic challenges, developing administrative vocabulary that could accurately describe hybrid institutions in both Persian and local languages, and legal complications arising from the need to create new categories of imperial authorization that didn't exist in traditional Persian law. Breakthrough moments occurred when pilot program results demonstrated that hybrid institutions were not only compatible with imperial administration, but actually generated higher tax revenues, provided better economic services to local populations, and created stronger popular support for Persian rule than traditional standardized approaches. The role of individuals versus larger forces in driving this change reveals the complex interaction between personal initiative and systemic pressures that characterizes most historical transformations. Individual pioneers like ancestral Ramat created successful models that demonstrated the potential of hybrid approaches, but the systematic adoption of these models required imperial recognition that cultural accommodation could serve imperial interests better than cultural suppression. Persian officials discovered that empowering local innovations often strengthened imperial control by creating stakeholders who benefited from Persian rule and therefore had incentives to support imperial stability. Temple women who had successfully adapted to Persian administration became advocates for Persian policies among populations that might otherwise have resented foreign control. The administrative mechanics of this transformation involved creating new bureaucratic procedures that could accommodate cultural diversity while maintaining imperial oversight. This required developing standardized methods for evaluating non-standard institutions, which sounds contradictory, but actually represents sophisticated administrative thinking about how to manage complexity without reducing everything to uniform simplicity. Training programs were established to help Persian administrators understand local cultural contexts and work effectively with hybrid institutions, while local leaders received education in imperial administrative procedures and legal frameworks. This mutual education process created a cadre of bicultural administrators who could navigate between different institutional systems with the fluency required for effective governance. The The documentation requirements for these new hybrid institutions were extensive, but they were designed to capture institutional knowledge rather than eliminate institutional diversity. Persian administrators had learned that understanding how successful local practices worked was more valuable than replacing them with familiar but less effective imperial alternatives. Quality control mechanisms were established to ensure that officially recognized local innovations actually served imperial objectives and maintained the standards expected of imperial institutions. This involved regular reviews, performance assessments, and comparative analyses that evaluated hybrid institutions against both local and imperial benchmarks. The result was an imperial administrative system that was more complex than traditional approaches, but also more effective at achieving imperial goals while maintaining popular support. Temple women found themselves operating within a framework that provided imperial protection and resources while preserving the autonomy necessary for continued innovation and economic success. This transformation established precedents for how the Persian Empire would handle similar situations in other territories, creating a systematic approach to cultural accommodation that recognized local expertise while maintaining imperial coherence. The success of this approach influenced Persian imperial policy for generations and demonstrated that effective governance often requires flexibility rather than rigidity in dealing with cultural diversity. The new system that emerged from this bureaucratic evolution was something that nobody had initially imagined, but that somehow managed to combine the best elements of both Persian imperial efficiency and Babylonian institutional innovation, while creating opportunities that hadn't existed under either pure system. How things were different becomes immediately apparent when you examine the legal status of temple women under the new arrangements. Instead of operating in the gray areas between Persian administrative categories, they now held official imperial appointments as regional economic development specialists, a job title that would make modern corporate consultants weep with envy for its combination of vagueness and importance. Who won and who lost from this transformation reveals the complex redistributions of power and opportunity that accompany most significant institutional changes. Temple women clearly won expanded legal protection, official recognition, and access to imperial resources and markets that had previously been difficult to access. Persian administrators won more effective local governance, higher tax revenues, and popular support from populations that appreciated competent economic management. The losers included Babylonian traditionalists like Selim Marduk, who had hoped that Persian conquest would eliminate female economic influence, and Persian purists who preferred the clarity of standardized policies to the complexity of accommodating cultural diversity. Both groups found themselves marginalized by a system that prioritized effectiveness over ideological purity. New rules and norms that emerged during this period included standardized procedures for documenting and evaluating hybrid institutions, legal frameworks for protecting local innovations while ensuring imperial oversight, and diplomatic protocols for managing relationships between imperial administrators and local cultural leaders. The most significant new norm involved the recognition that imperial strength could be enhanced rather than threatened by institutional diversity, provided that diverse institutions were properly integrated into imperial administrative and economic systems. This represented a fundamental shift from imperial policies based on cultural uniformity to imperial policies based on systematic accommodation of effective local practices. What stayed the same versus what changed dramatically reveals the selective nature of this transformation. The fundamental economic activities of temple women, property management, agricultural operations, textile production, banking services remained essentially unchanged, but their legal status, political protection, and access to resources were dramatically improved. The administrative structure of temples remained recognizably Babylonian, but it was now integrated into Persian imperial hierarchies in ways that provided both local autonomy and imperial oversight. Religious practices continued according to traditional Babylonian forms, but they were now officially recognized and protected by imperial law rather than merely tolerated as local customs. The most dramatic change involved the expansion of temple women's economic activities beyond their traditional regional focus to include imperial-scale operations that connected Babylonian institutions with markets and resources throughout the Persian Empire. This transformation turned successful local businesswomen into imperial economic agents with opportunities and responsibilities that exceeded anything that had been possible under pure Babylonian or pure Persian systems. Cultural exchange accelerated as temple women began training Persian women in Babylonian business methods while learning Persian administrative techniques and legal procedures. This created a syncretic business culture that combined the entrepreneurial flexibility of Babylonian traditions with the organizational resources of Persian imperial systems. The new reality also included expanded educational opportunities as temple complexes became centers for training administrators, merchants, and craftspeople from throughout the empire in advanced economic and administrative techniques. This educational function enhanced the political importance of temple women while creating new sources of revenue and influence that strengthened their institutional positions. Was this change a triumph of pragmatic accommodation over cultural imperialism, or a clever form of co-optation that ultimately served imperial interests at the expense of authentic local autonomy? The answer depends largely on your perspective about whether successful adaptation represents cultural survival or cultural surrender. Different perspectives on this transformation reveal the complexity of evaluating historical change when the results satisfy some goals while compromising others. Temple women achieved expanded economic opportunities, legal protection, and political influence that exceeded anything available under traditional Babylonian systems. But they also accepted integration into imperial structures that limited their institutional independence and subjected them to Persian oversight. Persian administrators achieved more effective governance, higher tax revenues, and stronger popular support than traditional imperial policies had provided. But they also accepted a level of institutional complexity and cultural accommodation that made imperial administration more difficult and potentially undermined imperial unity in other territories. Short-term versus long-term effects present different evaluative frameworks for assessing this transformation. In the short term, the changes clearly benefited most participants by creating opportunities that satisfied both Persian imperial objectives and Babylonian institutional interests. However, the long-term effects included the gradual integration of local institutions into imperial systems in ways that eventually eliminated their distinctive characteristics. Unintended consequences of this successful accommodation included the development of imperial policies that were difficult to apply consistently across different territories, the creation of precedents that encouraged other regions to demand similar treatment, and the establishment of administrative frameworks that were more dependent on individual relationships and cultural knowledge than traditional imperial systems. Modern judgment versus contemporary views reveals interesting disconnects between how this transformation was perceived at the time and how it appears from historical perspective. Contemporary participants generally viewed these changes as successful problem-solving that created beneficial outcomes for everyone involved. Modern historians are more likely to see them as examples of sophisticated imperial co-optation that used cultural accommodation to achieve imperial control more effectively than direct suppression. The ultimate evaluation probably requires recognizing that this transformation represented both successful cultural adaptation and effective imperial governance. demonstrating that historical change often produces complex outcomes that satisfy multiple objectives, while creating new challenges that nobody anticipated. The temple women of Babylon managed to preserve and expand their economic activities within imperial frameworks that provided protection and opportunities, but at the cost of accepting integration into systems that ultimately transformed the nature of their institutions in fundamental ways. In the years and decades that followed Darius's bureaucratic masterstroke, the hybrid system of officially sanctioned temple women's economic empires evolved in ways that would have made the original Babylonian priestesses either proud or horrified, depending on their feelings about Persian administrative efficiency and standardized accounting procedures. How things developed during the 5th century BCE reads like a case study in what happens when you successfully institutionalize innovation. It gets bigger, more complex, and inevitably starts generating the kind of bureaucratic complications that make you nostalgic for the good old days, when everything was chaotic, but at least you understood why it was chaotic. The new challenges that emerged included managing the success of hybrid institutions that had grown beyond their original scope and purpose. Temple women who had started as local economic managers found themselves running imperial-scale operations that connected markets from Egypt to India, requiring administrative skills that would challenge modern multinational corporate executives. Evolution of the situation involved the gradual transformation of temple complexes from primarily religious institutions with economic functions into primarily economic institutions with religious functions. This wasn't necessarily a bad thing, but it represented a fundamental shift in institutional identity that created new tensions between traditional religious roles and expanded economic responsibilities. Second-generation effects became apparent as the children of successful temple women grew up in a world where female economic leadership was normal rather than exceptional, creating cultural expectations and social patterns that differed significantly from both traditional Babylonian and traditional Persian norms. The most fascinating development involved the emergence of what historians now call imperial temple networks, formally coordinated economic relationships between temple complexes throughout the Persian Empire that functioned as the ancient equivalent of multinational corporations with religious headquarters. These networks facilitated trade, shared business practices, coordinated investments, and provided financial services on a scale that had never existed before. Administrative innovations required to manage these expanded operations included the development of standardized accounting procedures that could track complex transactions across multiple currencies and legal systems, diplomatic protocols for managing business relationships that crossed imperial territorial boundaries, and legal frameworks for resolving disputes that involved both religious and commercial considerations. Quality control became increasingly important as the success of Babylonian hybrid institutions led to attempts to replicate them in other parts of the empire, often with mixed results that demonstrated the difficulty of transplanting cultural innovations without understanding their underlying social and economic foundations. The Persian imperial government found itself in the interesting position of needing to regulate institutions that were simultaneously local religious centers and international business enterprises, requiring administrative flexibility that stretched imperial legal and bureaucratic frameworks in ways that nobody had anticipated. Training programs expanded to include not just Persian administrators learning to work with local institutions, but also temple women from different regions learning to coordinate their activities across cultural and linguistic boundaries. This created the ancient equivalent of international business schools run by religious institutions. The economic impact of these developments extended far beyond the original participants to influence trade patterns, agricultural productivity, and financial services throughout the Persian Empire in ways that contributed to the general prosperity and stability that characterized the peak period of Persian imperial success. The second and third generations of this hybrid system produced new important figures and institutions that differed dramatically from their predecessors in both their capabilities and their cultural assumptions about what was normal and possible for women in economic and religious roles. Adi Marduk Balaku, the daughter of one of the original temple women who had successfully navigated the Persian transition, represented a new type of leader who grew up bilingual in Persian and Babylonian, fluent in both imperial administrative procedures and traditional religious practices, and comfortable operating in cultural contexts that would have seemed impossibly complex to earlier generations. Her role involved managing economic relationships that spanned the entire Persian Empire, from coordinating grain shipments between Babylonian agricultural estates and Egyptian markets to facilitating textile trade between Mesopotamian workshops and Greek commercial networks. She was essentially running a multinational corporation disguised as a religious institution, except that the religious functions were genuine, and the corporate structure was more sophisticated than anything that existed in the purely secular economy. How she differed from earlier players becomes clear when you examine her correspondence, which demonstrates a level of cultural fluency and institutional sophistication that represents the successful evolution of hybrid cultural accommodation. Where earlier temple women had needed to navigate between different cultural systems, Adi Marduk Balaku operated within a synthetic culture that combined elements from multiple traditions into something that was recognizably distinct from any of its sources. That the contributions of figures like her involved not just managing existing operations, but also innovating new approaches to economic organization that took advantage of imperial resources and opportunities while maintaining the institutional autonomy that made temple women's operations successful. She developed new forms of credit instruments, investment partnerships, and trade relationships that influenced commercial practices throughout the ancient world. But perhaps the most significant new institutional development was the emergence of imperial temple academies, educational institutions that trained young women from throughout the Persian Empire in the administrative, economic, and diplomatic skills required for managing complex hybrid institutions. These academies represented a fundamental innovation in ancient education by providing systematic training in what we would now recognize as international business administration, comparative law, and cross-cultural communication. Students learned multiple languages, studied different legal systems, practiced advanced accounting techniques, and received training in diplomatic protocol that prepared them for careers managing economic relationships across cultural boundaries. The disruptions these academies caused to traditional educational and social patterns were considerable. Young women who received this training returned to their home regions with skills and expectations that often didn't fit traditional cultural roles, creating tensions between imperial opportunities and local customs that required ongoing negotiation and accommodation. Specific stories about these new elements include the remarkable case of Bail Uzalim, a Persian woman who attended one of these academies and returned to establish similar hybrid institutions in her home province, adapting Babylonian economic methods to Persian cultural contexts in ways that demonstrated the transferability of successful innovations across cultural boundaries. Her success led to the establishment of similar programs throughout the empire, creating a network of culturally diverse but methodologically similar institutions that facilitated economic integration while preserving local cultural identities. This represented a sophisticated approach to imperial administration that balanced unity and diversity in ways that modern political scientists still study as examples of effective multicultural governance. The new players also included Persian male administrators who had learned to work effectively with these hybrid institutions and who became advocates for their expansion to other parts of the empire. These men represented a new type of imperial official who understood that cultural accommodation could strengthen rather than weaken imperial authority when it was properly managed and systematically implemented. But some problems persisted with the stubborn determination of weeds in a carefully maintained garden, proving that even the most successful institutional innovations can't solve every challenge and sometimes create new problems that nobody anticipated. Continuing challenges included the ongoing tension between religious authenticity and economic success that had always characterized temple women's activities, but became more acute as their operations expanded to imperial scale. Critics argued that institutions that spent most of their time managing international trade relationships and investment portfolios were temples in name only, while defenders pointed out that economic success enabled religious activities that wouldn't be possible with traditional funding methods. What didn't get resolved involved fundamental questions about the relationship between religious authority and economic power that had implications extending far beyond the specific case of Babylonian temple women. The success of hybrid institutions raised broader questions about whether religious institutions should engage in extensive economic activities and whether economic success enhanced or compromised religious authenticity. New versions of old problems emerged as the expansion of temple women's economic activities created competition with secular merchants and banking operations that resented the advantages provided by religious tax exemptions and imperial protection. These secular competitors argued that hybrid institutions represented unfair competition that undermined free market principles, while temple women pointed out that their operations provided public services and economic stability that purely commercial enterprises couldn't or wouldn't provide. Cyclical patterns developed around periodic attempts by imperial administrators to reform or restrict temple women's economic activities, usually followed by demonstrations that these restrictions reduced economic efficiency and tax revenues, leading to restoration of previous policies with minor modifications designed to address specific complaints without undermining overall effectiveness. Why certain issues proved intractable relates to fundamental contradictions between different cultural assumptions about the proper relationship between religious and economic activities that couldn't be resolved through administrative accommodation because they involved deeply held beliefs about the nature of spiritual and material pursuits. The most persistent ongoing issue involved the question of succession and institutional continuity, as the original generation of temple women who had created successful hybrid institutions aged and needed to transfer their responsibilities to younger women who had different cultural backgrounds and different relationships with both religious traditions and imperial administration. Generational conflicts emerged between older temple women who remembered the pre-Persian system and younger women who had grown up within imperial frameworks, leading to disagreements about institutional priorities, business practices, and the proper balance between traditional religious functions and expanded economic responsibilities. Legal complications continue to arise from the difficulty of applying standardized imperial laws to institutions that operated according to hybrid cultural frameworks, requiring constant negotiation and clarification about jurisdictional authority, regulatory compliance, and dispute resolution procedures. Regional variations in how hybrid institutions developed created inconsistencies that complicated imperial administration and occasionally led to conflicts between different temple networks that had evolved different approaches to managing similar challenges. The most intractable problem involved the growing complexity of managing institutions that had become so successful that they required administrative capabilities that exceeded the training and experience of traditional religious personnel, while secular administrators often lacked the cultural knowledge and religious authority necessary for effective leadership of temple-based institutions. This created ongoing tension between institutional effectiveness and cultural authenticity that couldn't be resolved through policy changes because it reflected fundamental contradictions between the requirements of large-scale economic operations and the cultural foundations that had made temple women's original success possible. The persistence of these problems demonstrated that even successful cultural accommodation has limits and that some tensions between different value systems and institutional requirements can be managed but not eliminated through administrative innovation and bureaucratic creativity. Compared to earlier periods when temple women had operated primarily within Babylonian cultural and political frameworks, the imperial period represented both unprecedented opportunities and unprecedented challenges that created institutional capabilities that exceeded anything available in the purely local system, while also creating dependencies and vulnerabilities that hadn't existed before. What was unique about the Persian period hybrid institutions involved their scale, complexity, and cultural diversity, which enabled economic and political influence that exceeded anything possible within traditional Babylonian or Persian frameworks, but also required administrative and diplomatic skills that pushed the boundaries of what individual leaders could reasonably be expected to master. What was universal about this experience involved the fundamental human challenges of managing cultural change, balancing competing priorities, and adapting successful local practices to larger political and economic systems. These challenges appear consistently throughout human history whenever successful local innovations encounter imperial or global systems that offer expanded opportunities at the cost of increased complexity and reduced autonomy. Lessons that could be learned from this experience include understanding that successful cultural accommodation requires systematic attention to both practical administration and symbolic recognition, that institutional innovation often succeeds better when it builds on existing cultural foundations rather than replacing them entirely, and that sustainable change usually involves gradual evolution rather than dramatic transformation. The Persian approach of systematic accommodation rather than forced assimilation provided a model for managing cultural diversity that influenced later imperial systems and demonstrated that effective governance often requires flexibility and creativity rather than rigid adherence to standardized policies. Patterns that repeated elsewhere include similar developments in other parts of the Persian Empire, where local institutions were successfully integrated into imperial frameworks while maintaining their distinctive characteristics, and later examples from Roman, Islamic, and modern imperial systems that face similar challenges in managing cultural diversity while maintaining political unity. The comparison with contemporary approaches to similar challenges reveals interesting parallels between ancient Persian methods for managing multicultural institutions and modern techniques for international business administration, cross-cultural management, and global governance that suggest certain fundamental principles for successful cultural accommodation remain constant across historical periods. Modern multinational corporations face similar challenges in adapting successful local business practices to global frameworks while maintaining cultural sensitivity and local effectiveness, while international organizations struggle with questions about balancing standardization and local autonomy that echo the administrative challenges faced by Persian imperial administrators. The most significant comparative insight involves understanding that the success of Persian-era hybrid institutions depended on finding the right balance between imperial integration and local autonomy. Too much integration eliminated the cultural foundations that made local institutions effective, while too much autonomy reduced the benefits of imperial resources and protection. This balance point proved difficult to maintain over time as both imperial priorities and local circumstances evolved. leading to ongoing adjustments that required constant negotiation and occasional crisis management that tested the resilience of hybrid institutional frameworks. The Persian experience demonstrated that successful cultural accommodation is an ongoing process rather than a one-time achievement, requiring sustained attention to changing circumstances and willingness to adapt institutional arrangements as political, economic, and cultural conditions evolve. By the late 5th century BCE, signs pointed to fundamental changes coming to the hybrid temple system that would make the original Persian administrative adjustments look like minor policy tweaks compared to the institutional earthquake that was building beneath the surface of imperial stability. Warning signs appeared in the form of increasing administrative centralization as later Persian rulers became less comfortable with the institutional autonomy that had made temple women's economic empires successful. Successive Persian kings, dealing with rebellions and military pressures that required more direct control over imperial resources, began viewing local autonomy as a luxury they could no longer afford. What key players could see versus what they missed reveals the classic pattern of institutional decline, where those closest to the system recognized the growing pressures, while those in positions to address them remained focused on immediate concerns that seemed more urgent than long-term institutional sustainability. Temple women like Morisichu, whose business archive from this period reads like a manual for crisis management, could see that imperial policies were gradually restricting their operational flexibility, while increasing their administrative obligations, in ways that made their traditional business model less sustainable. Her correspondence shows growing concern about new taxation policies, restricted access to international markets, and increased imperial oversight that limited the autonomous decision-making that had been crucial to their success. Persian administrators, meanwhile, seemed largely oblivious to how their incremental policy changes were undermining the foundations of institutions that had been generating substantial imperial revenues and maintaining regional stability. They were focused on immediate fiscal pressures and military requirements that made centralized control seem like the obvious solution to imperial challenges. The resistance to inevitable change came from multiple directions. Temple women attempted to preserve their autonomy through legal challenges, diplomatic negotiations, and strategic alliances with Persian officials who understood the value of their operations. Some tried to adapt by scaling back their activities to fit within more restrictive administrative frameworks, while others attempted to relocate their operations to regions where imperial oversight was less intensive. Persian traditionalists, who had never been comfortable with the cultural accommodation that hybrid institutions represented, saw the changing political climate as an opportunity to implement more standardized policies that would eliminate what they viewed as administrative anomalies that complicated imperial governance. The most significant warning sign involved a growing financial pressure on temple operations as imperial taxation increased, while operational restrictions reduced their ability to generate revenues through traditional methods. The economic model that had sustained temple women's success required a specific balance of autonomy, market access, and imperial protection that was being gradually undermined by policy changes designed to address other imperial priorities. Generational factors also contributed to institutional vulnerability, as younger temple women who had grown up within the hybrid system lacked the adaptive skills and cultural knowledge that had enabled earlier generations to navigate political transitions successfully. They were excellent at managing established operations, but less capable of innovating solutions to unprecedented challenges. The convergence of these various pressures created a situation where successful adaptation to previous challenges had actually reduced institutional resilience by creating dependencies on political arrangements that proved less stable than anyone had anticipated. How the era of temple women's economic independence ended reads like a slow-motion institutional collapse. where each individual decision seemed reasonable, but the cumulative effect was the dismantling of a system that had taken centuries to develop and had provided unprecedented opportunities for female economic and social leadership. The specific events that marked the definitive end began around 450 BCE when Artaxerxes I implemented comprehensive fiscal reforms designed to address imperial financial pressures created by ongoing military campaigns and administrative expansion. These reforms included standardized taxation policies that eliminated many of the special arrangements that had allowed temple institutions to operate with the financial flexibility necessary for their economic activities. Final major players in this institutional drama included Bahramani, one of the last temple women to operate at the scale and with the autonomy that had characterized the peak period of hybrid institutions. Her attempts to preserve temple women's traditional roles through legal appeals and diplomatic negotiations provide a detailed record of how individuals attempted to resist systemic changes that were beyond their ability to control. The last attempts to preserve traditional arrangements involved increasingly desperate efforts to demonstrate the continued value of temple women's economic activities to imperial administrators, who were focused on immediate fiscal needs rather than long-term institutional sustainability. Temple women submitted detailed financial reports showing their contributions to imperial revenues, offered to accept increased taxation in exchange for operational autonomy, and proposed alternative administrative arrangements that would satisfy imperial centralization requirements while preserving essential elements of their traditional functions. These efforts failed, not because they were unreasonable or ineffective, but because they addressed symptoms rather than causes of imperial policy changes that reflected fundamental shifts in how Persian rulers understood the relationship between central authority and local autonomy. The fiscal and military pressures facing the later Persian Empire created political incentives for centralization that outweighed the economic benefits of maintaining local institutional diversity. Dramatic final moments included the closure of the last independent temple academies that had trained women in the administrative and economic skills necessary for managing hybrid institutions. The end of these educational programs marked the moment when the system lost its ability to reproduce itself through new generations of trained personnel. The gradual decline of temple women's economic operations accelerated as imperial policies eliminated the special legal status, tax arrangements, and operational autonomy that had made their success possible. Many women attempted to continue their activities on a reduced scale within more restrictive administrative frameworks, but the economic model that has sustained large-scale operations proved unsustainable under changed conditions. Some temple women successfully transitioned to secular economic activities, using the skills and connections they had developed through religious service to establish private business operations that could function within the new regulatory environment. However, these individual adaptations represented the end of the systematic approach to female economic empowerment that had characterized the hybrid institutional period. Symbolic endpoints included the conversion of former temple complexes to purely administrative functions as Persian. Officials assumed direct control over properties and operations that had previously been managed by temple women. The transformation of these spaces from centers of female economic leadership to standard imperial administrative offices marked the visible end of an institutional experiment that had lasted for nearly 2 centuries. The final correspondence from this period reveals the personal cost of institutional change as women who had devoted their lives to building and managing complex economic operations watched their life's work disappear into imperial bureaucratic structures that had no appreciation for what they had accomplished or understanding of what was being lost. The most poignant final documents include letters between former temple women attempting to maintain personal and professional relationships that had been sustained by institutional frameworks that no longer existed. These letters reveal how the end of hybrid institutions affected not just economic activities, but also social networks and cultural practices that had developed around female economic leadership. The end wasn't marked by dramatic confrontation or violent suppression, but by administrative attrition that gradually eliminated the conditions that have made temple women's success possible, while offering no comparable alternatives for women who had the skills and ambitions that had previously found expression through religious institutional service. The analysis of causes reveals a complex interaction between internal institutional evolution and external political pressures that created conditions where successful adaptation to earlier challenges actually increased vulnerability to later ones, demonstrating how institutional survival often requires constant reinvention rather than perfection of existing approaches. Internal problems included the growing complexity of hybrid institutions that had become so successful that they required administrative capabilities and resources that stretched beyond what religious frameworks could sustainably provide. The temple women's economic empires had evolved beyond their original religious and cultural foundations in ways that made them dependent on political arrangements that proved less stable than the cultural traditions they had grown out of. The success of hybrid institutions had also created internal contradictions between religious authenticity and economic efficiency that became more acute as operations expanded to imperial scale. Younger generations of temple women were increasingly focused on economic management rather than religious service, creating cultural tensions that undermined the institutional legitimacy that had originally made their economic activities acceptable within religious frameworks. External pressures included the fiscal and military demands facing the later Persian Empire that created political incentives for administrative centralization that were incompatible with the local autonomy that hybrid institutions required. Imperial administrators facing budget shortfalls and military emergencies naturally prioritized immediate control over resources rather than long-term institutional sustainability. The role of individuals versus historical forces in this decline demonstrates how personal decisions and institutional choices interact with broader political and economic trends in ways that can accelerate or mitigate systematic changes, but rarely prevent them entirely. Individual temple women made strategic choices that sometimes delayed institutional decline, but couldn't address the fundamental political changes that were undermining their operational foundations. What could have been done differently involves counterfactual speculation about whether alternative strategies might have preserved essential elements of temple women's economic activities within changed political circumstances. Some historians argue that earlier adaptation to imperial centralization trends might have enabled continued female economic participation within more restricted frameworks, while others contend that the institutional foundations of temple women's success were incompatible with the administrative standardization that imperial pressures required. The question of inevitability versus contingency in this institutional decline reflects broader debates about whether successful cultural accommodation can survive fundamental political transitions or whether hybrid institutions are inherently vulnerable to changes in the political systems that protect their existence. Alternative approaches that might have preserved some version of temple women's economic activities include earlier development of secular business networks that weren't dependent on religious institutional protection, or more systematic efforts to demonstrate the strategic value of hybrid institutions to imperial administrators focused on centralization and efficiency. However, the fundamental challenge involved reconciling the requirements of large-scale economic operations with the cultural and political foundations that had made temple women's original success possible. The hybrid institutions that emerged During the early Persian period represented a unique historical moment when imperial policies encouraged local innovation and cultural accommodation in ways that wouldn't be repeated under changed political circumstances. The decline ultimately reflected not the failure of individual adaptation strategies, but the inherent difficulty of maintaining institutional innovations that depend on specific political arrangements within imperial systems that prioritize standardization and centralize control over local autonomy and cultural diversity. Understanding why this system ended requires recognizing that institutional success often creates dependencies and expectations that make adaptation to changed circumstances more difficult rather than easier, and that historical progress rarely involves preserving successful innovations unchanged through periods of fundamental political and cultural transformation. The immediate aftermath was a fascinating study in how quickly sophisticated institutional arrangements can disappear once the political and cultural conditions that sustain them no longer exist, while leaving behind scattered remnants that influence later developments in ways that are often difficult to recognize or trace. Who stepped into the vacuum left by the decline of temple women's economic activities included imperial administrators, who assumed direct control over properties and operations that had previously been managed through hybrid institutions, secular merchants who expanded their activities to fill economic roles that temple women had previously performed, and Persian women who attempted to adapt some elements of Babylonian business methods to their own cultural contexts. Short-term consequences included the disruption of economic networks that had facilitated trade and financial services throughout the Persian Empire, creating temporary instability in regional markets that had become dependent on temple women's coordination and management. The elimination of temple academies that had trained women in advanced administrative and economic skills created a gap in human resource development that affected imperial administrative efficiency for several generations. Contemporary reactions varied considerably depending on cultural background and personal involvement with hybrid institutions. Persian traditionalists who had always been uncomfortable with cultural accommodation viewed the changes as necessary corrections that would improve imperial administration, while Babylonian communities that had benefited from temple women's economic activities experienced the changes as cultural loss that reduced both economic opportunities and social prestige for women. Some attempts at revival or continuation involved individual women trying to maintain elements of traditional economic activities through private arrangements that didn't require institutional support, while others involved efforts to preserve business methods and administrative techniques through informal education and professional networks that operated outside official imperial frameworks. The most significant immediate legacy involved the dispersion of knowledge, skills, and professional relationships that had been concentrated in temple institutions throughout the broader Persian Empire, creating informal networks of administrative and economic expertise that influenced imperial governance and commercial practices in ways that weren't immediately apparent but became important over longer time periods. The documentation and administrative methods developed by temple women influenced Persian imperial bureaucracy in ways that improved record-keeping, financial management, and cross-cultural administration throughout the empire, demonstrating how institutional innovations can survive the elimination of the institutions that created them by being absorbed into larger systems that benefit from their methods while not acknowledging their origins. Regional variations in how different areas adapted to the end of hybrid institutions created different patterns of cultural and economic development that influenced local social structures and gender roles for centuries after the formal end of temple women's economic activities. The legacy of Babylonian temple women shaped later developments in ways that would have made them either proud or deeply frustrated, depending on whether they valued having their innovations adopted by other cultures, or their actual contributions being properly credited and remembered by history. Specific influences of their institutional innovations appear throughout the Hellenistic world as Greek administrators who had served in the Persian Empire adapted Babylonian administrative methods for managing diverse populations and complex economic operations. The business practices developed by temple women influenced Greek approaches to international trade, banking operations, and multicultural administration in ways that contributed to the economic integration of the Mediterranean world. How later generations viewed these accomplishments reveals the persistent gap between what temple women actually achieved and how their activities were remembered or forgotten by subsequent cultures. Roman historians, when they bothered to mention Babylonian women at all, typically focused on the alleged sexual practices that Greek writers had sensationalized rather than the sophisticated economic and administrative systems that represented their real historical significance. The myths versus realities that developed around temple women demonstrate how historical narratives can become completely detached from historical evidence when the sensational version is more entertaining than the complicated truth. While Herodotus's accounts of sacred prostitution continued to be repeated and embellished by later writers, the documentary evidence of temple women's actual economic and administrative achievements was largely ignored because it required more effort to understand, and was less immediately titillating to ancient audiences who preferred exotic stories about foreign sexual customs. Why temple women's real accomplishments remained important to some scholars involves understanding that their innovations in business organization, cross-cultural administration, and female economic leadership provided models that influenced institutional development throughout the ancient world, even when their specific contributions weren't explicitly recognized or credited. The administrative methods they developed for managing complex multicultural institutions influenced Roman provincial administration, Islamic approaches to governing diverse populations, and medieval European techniques for organizing international trade and financial services. Their innovations in accounting procedures, contract law, and diplomatic protocol became standard practices that were adopted and adapted by successive civilizations without acknowledgement of their origins. Academic study of temple women's actual achievements didn't begin until modern archaeological methods made it possible to examine cuneiform business archives that revealed the scope and sophistication of their economic activities. This scholarly recognition came over 2 millennia after their institutional framework had disappeared, demonstrating how long it can take for historical understanding to catch up with historical reality. The influence on later approaches to female economic and social leadership remained largely indirect because the specific institutional frameworks that had made temple women's success possible weren't replicated in later cultures. However, their example of using religious institutions as pathways to economic and social power influenced women's strategies throughout history, from medieval abbesses who accumulated wealth and political influence to modern women who use educational and non-profit institutions to build economic and social capital. Why people eventually forgot about their real achievements while remembering sensationalized accounts involves understanding how historical memory works. Complex institutional innovations require sustained scholarly attention to understand and appreciate. While scandalous stories about exotic sexual practices can be understood immediately and repeated endlessly without requiring any deep knowledge of cultural context or historical evidence, the irony that their sophisticated business empires were forgotten while fictional accounts of temple prostitution became part of popular historical consciousness demonstrates how historical narratives often reflect the interests and biases of those who control historical memory rather than the actual experiences and achievements of historical actors. Modern efforts to recover and understand temple women's real contributions represent part of broader Scholarly movements to examine women's roles in ancient history beyond the limited categories of wives, mothers, and sexual objects that have traditionally dominated historical accounts, revealing complex patterns of female agency and achievement that challenge conventional assumptions about women's capabilities and opportunities in ancient societies. Today, we can see echoes of Babylonian temple women's strategies and challenges in contemporary situations where women use institutional frameworks to build economic and social power while navigating complex cultural expectations and administrative requirements that often weren't designed to accommodate their ambitions and capabilities. Specific parallels appear in modern examples of women who use religious, educational, and non-profit institutions as platforms for economic and social leadership in ways that mirror the temple women's approach to leveraging institutional authority and cultural legitimacy to create opportunities that wouldn't be available through conventional business or political channels. Contemporary women entrepreneurs who use social impact investing, sustainable business practices, or mission-driven organizations to build economic empires while addressing social needs follow strategies that are remarkably similar to those developed by temple women who combined religious service with economic leadership. Like their ancient predecessors, these modern women often find that institutional frameworks that emphasize social good rather than pure profit provide more cultural legitimacy and political protection for ambitious economic activities. The challenges faced by modern women in international business, cross-cultural management, and global governance mirror many of the issues that temple women encountered when managing economic operations across different cultural and administrative systems. Contemporary executives who work for multinational corporations, international nonprofits, or global educational institutions face similar requirements for cultural fluency, diplomatic skills, and administrative flexibility that enable temple women to succeed in multicultural imperial environments. What hasn't changed about human nature includes the persistent tendency for innovative approaches to economic and social organization to be misunderstood, sensationalized, or dismissed by observers who lack the cultural knowledge or patience required to understand what they're actually observing. Modern women's achievements in business, politics, and social leadership are often subject to the same kinds of reductive stereotyping and cultural misinterpretation that affected historical understanding of temple women's activities. Similar patterns in different contexts appear in contemporary situations where women use alternative institutional pathways to accumulate wealth and influence because traditional business and political structures remain difficult to navigate. Modern examples include women who build economic power through social media platforms, educational institutions, artistic communities, or advocacy organizations that provide cultural legitimacy and community support for ambitious activities that might be viewed with suspicion in purely commercial contexts. The modern equivalent of Persian administrative confusion about how to categorize temple women's activities appears in contemporary bureaucratic struggles to classify and regulate hybrid institutions that combine profit and non-profit functions, traditional and innovative business methods, or local and global operational frameworks. Modern regulatory agencies often display the same kind of bureaucratic bewilderment that Persian administrators experienced when trying to apply standardized policies to institutions that don't fit conventional categories. Contemporary parallels to the cultural accommodation strategies that made temple women successful include modern approaches to diversity and inclusion in multinational organizations, cross-cultural business practices in global markets, and international development. Programs that attempt to preserve local cultural values while implementing modern institutional methods. The lessons for contemporary issues include understanding that successful innovation often requires finding ways to work within existing institutional frameworks, while gradually transforming them, that cultural legitimacy can be as important as technical competence for sustainable success, and that adaptation to changing political and economic conditions requires maintaining core capabilities while remaining flexible about operational methods. Modern women's business networks that operate across cultural and national boundaries face similar challenges to those encountered by imperial temple networks in maintaining coordination and mutual support while adapting to different legal systems, cultural expectations, and political requirements. Contemporary examples include international professional women's organizations, global social entrepreneurship networks, and cross-cultural educational initiatives that facilitate economic cooperation and knowledge sharing among women from different cultural backgrounds. The persistence of gender-based challenges in achieving economic and social leadership demonstrates that many of the obstacles faced by temple women remain relevant today, even in societies that theoretically provide equal opportunities for women's advancement. The strategies developed by temple women for building economic power through institutional service, leveraging cultural authority for business purposes, and creating supportive networks for mutual advancement continue to influence contemporary approaches to female economic empowerment and social leadership. Even now, the institutional innovations developed by Babylonian temple women influence contemporary areas in ways that are often unrecognized because their specific contributions have been absorbed into broader traditions of business organization, administrative management, and cultural accommodation that span multiple civilizations and historical periods. Academic study of temple women's achievements continues to influence scholarly understanding of women's roles in ancient history, economic development in early imperial systems, and cultural accommodation strategies in multicultural societies. Their example provides evidence that challenges conventional assumptions about women's capabilities and opportunities in ancient societies, while demonstrating sophisticated approaches to institutional innovation that remain relevant for contemporary organizational development. Popular culture has been slower to recognize temple women's real achievements, but growing interest in women's economic history and ancient business practices has begun to influence historical fiction, educational materials, and media representations that move beyond sensationalized accounts of ancient sexuality to explore the complex realities of women's economic and social leadership in ancient societies. Political discourse about women's economic empowerment, cultural accommodation in diverse societies, and institutional innovation in global governance increasingly draws on historical examples that include temple women's strategies and achievements, even when their specific contributions aren't explicitly acknowledged or fully understood. Social movements focused on female economic empowerment, sustainable business practices, and cross-cultural cooperation continue to develop strategies that echo approaches pioneered by temple women, demonstrating the continued relevance of their innovations for contemporary challenges in creating economic opportunities for women, while maintaining cultural authenticity and community support. Why people still care about understanding temple women's real story involves recognizing that their achievements provide evidence for alternative approaches to economic organization, gender roles, and cultural accommodation that challenge conventional assumptions about what's possible and necessary in human social organization. The continuing academic interest in their story reflects broader scholarly movements to recover women's contributions to economic and administrative development, understand the complexity of ancient societies beyond stereotypical representations, and examine historical examples of successful cultural accommodation that might provide insights for contemporary challenges in managing diversity and promoting inclusive economic development. Educational institutions increasingly include Temple women's achievements in curricula focused on women's studies, ancient history, and international business, recognizing that their innovations provide valuable case studies for understanding historical approaches to challenges that remain relevant in contemporary global society. The preservation and study of cuneiform archives continues to reveal new information about Temple women's activities and achievements, ensuring that scholarly understanding of their contributions will continue to evolve and influence contemporary discussions about women's economic leadership, institutional innovation, and cultural accommodation strategies. The ultimate irony of the Temple women's historical legacy involves the complete reversal between what they actually accomplished and what they're remembered for, demonstrating how historical memory can become entirely disconnected from historical reality when sensational fiction proves more entertaining than complex truth. While Herodotus' probably fictional accounts of sacred prostitution became part of popular historical consciousness and continue to influence contemporary understanding of ancient Babylonian religion, the sophisticated economic empires, administrative innovations, and institutional leadership strategies developed by actual Temple women were largely forgotten until modern archaeological research began revealing the documentary evidence of their real achievements. This disconnect between historical reputation and historical reality represents more than just scholarly correction of ancient misinformation. It reveals how cultural biases and narrative preferences can shape historical memory in ways that obscure rather than illuminate the experiences and accomplishments of historical actors, particularly women whose achievements don't fit conventional categories or expectations. The recovery of Temple women's real story through modern scholarship provides not just historical correction, but also contemporary inspiration for understanding alternative approaches to economic organization, gender roles, and institutional innovation that challenge assumptions about what's possible and necessary in human social development. Their example demonstrates that historical progress often involves rediscovering and adapting innovations that were developed in different cultural contexts rather than inventing entirely new solutions to persistent human challenges. Looking back across nearly 3 millennia of historical journey, we've seen how a sensationalized story about sacred prostitution obscured one of history's most remarkable experiments in female economic empowerment, cultural accommodation, and institutional innovation that challenges everything we thought we knew about women's capabilities and opportunities in the ancient world. The key patterns that emerge throughout this story reveal how historical memory often preserves the most scandalous rather than the most significant aspects of human experience, how cultural accommodation can create opportunities that pure tradition or pure innovation cannot achieve, and how successful institutional frameworks often contain the seeds of their own transformation in ways that make adaptation both necessary and difficult. The most surprising discoveries along our journey involved understanding that Babylonian temple women weren't just religious figures who happened to be good at business. They were sophisticated economic and administrative leaders who used religious institutional frameworks to create systematic approaches to female empowerment that exceeded anything available in secular contexts and wouldn't be matched in the Western world for another 2 millennia. The most important takeaways include recognizing that historical progress often involves rediscovering and adapting innovations that were developed in different cultural contexts rather than assuming that contemporary approaches represent the first or best solutions to persistent human challenges, and understanding that institutional success requires constant adaptation to changing circumstances rather than perfection of existing methods. How our understanding has evolved throughout this exploration demonstrates the difference between accepting historical narratives at face value and examining the documentary evidence that reveals the complex realities behind simplified or sensationalized accounts. The temple women's real story required piecing together business archives, administrative records, and legal documents that paint a picture completely different from the exotic tales that dominated historical memory. The transformation of our perspective from the opening misconceptions about temple prostitution to the closing understanding of sophisticated economic empires illustrates how archaeological evidence can completely revolutionize historical understanding. When scholars are willing to look beyond traditional narratives and examine what people actually did rather than what others said they did, the contrast between the simplistic narrative of religious prostitution and the complex reality of hybrid institutional innovation reveals how cultural biases and entertainment preferences can shape historical memory in ways that obscure rather than illuminate the experiences and achievements of historical actors, particularly women whose accomplishments don't fit conventional categories. The journey from confusion about Persian administrative policies to appreciation for sophisticated approaches to cultural accommodation demonstrates how historical understanding benefits from examining multiple perspectives and recognizing that what initially appears as bureaucratic incompetence might actually represent innovative approaches to complex challenges that contemporary observers didn't fully understand. The evolution from individual stories of successful women to recognition of systematic approaches to institutional innovation shows how historical analysis can reveal patterns and strategies that have broader implications beyond the specific cultural context where they were originally developed. Most fundamentally, our journey reveals how the most interesting and important historical stories often involve the intersection of multiple cultural traditions, the adaptation of successful practices to changing circumstances, and the creative problem-solving that emerges when people face challenges that require innovative solutions rather than conventional approaches. One final compelling anecdote that encapsulates the broader themes of our entire exploration involves a cuneiform tablet discovered in the 1980s at Sippar, written by a temple woman named Amat Marduk Balaku in the final years of the Persian period, as the institutional framework that had enabled her success was collapsing around her. The tablet contains what appears to be a training manual for young women entering temple service, but it reads more like a guide for navigating institutional change and maintaining professional effectiveness in uncertain circumstances. Her advice ranges from practical business management techniques to diplomatic strategies for working with culturally diverse administrators. But the most poignant sections involve her reflections on how to preserve essential values and relationships while adapting to fundamental changes in political and economic conditions. Why this story encapsulates our broader themes becomes clear when you realize that Amat Marduk Balaku was simultaneously looking backward to preserve the knowledge and traditions that had made temple women successful while looking forward to prepare future generations for circumstances that would require different strategies and different capabilities than had been necessary during the peak period of hybrid institutional success. What her training manual reveals about the intersection of personal resilience and institutional adaptation demonstrates that successful navigation of historical change requires both individual capability and systematic understanding of how cultural and political systems work. Her advice to young women about maintaining professional networks, developing multiple skill sets, and building relationships across cultural boundaries reflects sophisticated understanding of how to create sustainable careers in unstable institutional environments. How this connects to everything we've discussed appears in her recognition that the specific institutional frameworks that had enabled temple women's economic empires were changing in ways that couldn't be prevented or reversed, but that the underlying capabilities, relationships, and cultural knowledge that had made those institutions successful could be preserved and adapted to new circumstances if people were creative and flexible about finding alternative pathways to similar objectives. The broader significance of her perspective involves understanding that historical change doesn't necessarily mean historical loss if people can identify the essential elements of what they're trying to preserve and find new ways to maintain those elements within changed circumstances. Her approach to institutional transition demonstrates the kind of creative adaptation that has enabled human societies to maintain cultural continuity while adapting to political and economic transformation throughout history. The memorable final image that emerges from her training manual involves her description of temple women as gardeners of possibility, who cultivated opportunities for themselves and others through patient attention to both immediate practical requirements and long-term strategic development. This metaphor captures both the nurturing aspect of their approach to institutional development and the strategic thinking that enabled them to create sustainable economic and social achievements. Her final thought, preserved in the closing lines of the tablet, reflects on how the success of temple women's economic activities had always depended on their ability to demonstrate that female economic leadership served broader community interests rather than just individual advancement. She concludes with the observation that this principle would remain relevant regardless of what institutional frameworks might emerge to replace the hybrid system that was ending during her lifetime. The wisdom embedded in her perspective suggests that the most important legacy of temple women's achievements wasn't their specific institutional innovations, but their demonstration that alternative approaches to economic organization and gender roles were possible when people were willing to think creatively about how to work within existing cultural and political frameworks while gradually transforming them to create expanded opportunities for human flourishing. As we reach the end of tonight's journey through the labyrinth of historical memory and archaeological discovery, there's something deeply satisfying about uncovering a story that reveals how much more interesting and inspiring historical reality can be than the sensationalized fiction that often passes for historical knowledge. The general conclusion that emerges from understanding temple women's real achievements involves recognizing that human creativity and resilience have always found ways to create opportunities and build meaningful lives, even within institutional and cultural constraints that seem limiting or oppressive from contemporary perspectives. Their success wasn't just about individual determination. It was about collective wisdom that developed systematic approaches to challenges that remain relevant today. Our appreciation for this historical journey extends beyond just correcting misconceptions about ancient Babylonian religion or adding interesting details to our understanding of Persian imperial administration. The temple women's story provides evidence that alternative approaches to economic organization, gender roles, and cultural accommodation have been tested and proven successful in historical contexts, offering inspiration and practical insights for contemporary challenges. The invitation to reflection that emerges from their example involves considering how often our own assumptions about what's possible or necessary in human social organization might be limiting our ability to recognize or develop innovative solutions to persistent problems. If temple women could figure out how to create systematic approaches to female economic empowerment within ancient imperial frameworks, what might be possible within contemporary institutional contexts if we're willing to think as creatively about working within existing systems while gradually transforming them? The peaceful closing thought that settles over this entire exploration involves understanding that the most important historical stories often involve ordinary people doing extraordinary things through patient attention to both practical details and strategic vision. Temple women weren't superhuman. They were people who figured out how to leverage institutional opportunities, build supportive relationships, and adapt to changing circumstances in ways that created expanded possibilities for themselves and others. The broader human significance of their achievements transcends Their specific cultural and historical context to demonstrate that meaningful social change often happens through gradual institutional innovation, rather than dramatic confrontation, through cultural accommodation rather than cultural warfare, and through creative problem-solving that finds ways to preserve essential values while adapting to changing circumstances. There's something both humbling and inspiring about realizing that people living thousands of years ago developed sophisticated solutions to challenges that we're still working on today, and that their approaches often involve levels of cultural sensitivity, institutional creativity, and strategic thinking that exceed what we see in many contemporary efforts to address similar problems. The ultimate lesson from Temple Women's story might be that historical progress often involves rediscovering wisdom that was developed in different cultural contexts rather than assuming that we're the first generation to face particular challenges or develop innovative solutions. Their example suggests that learning from history requires moving beyond the simplified narratives that dominate popular understanding to examine the complex realities that reveal how people actually lived, worked, and solved problems in different times and places. As we dim the lights on this exploration of ancient Babylon's most misunderstood women, there's a quiet satisfaction in knowing that their real story has finally been told, that their actual achievements have been recognized, and that their example continues to influence contemporary thinking about institutional innovation, cultural accommodation, and female economic leadership. The soft background hum of historical continuity reminds us that we're part of the same ongoing human story that included Temple women creating economic empires disguised as religious service, Persian administrators learning to appreciate institutional innovations they initially didn't understand, and generations of scholars gradually piecing together documentary evidence that reveals how much more complex and interesting historical reality usually is than the simplified stories that get passed down through popular culture. Tonight's journey ends with the recognition that history's most important lessons often come not from the dramatic events that dominate textbooks, but from the patient work of people who figured out how to create meaningful opportunities within whatever circumstances they faced, how to build supportive relationships across cultural boundaries, and how to adapt successful practices to changing conditions while preserving the essential elements that made those practices valuable in the first place. And perhaps that's the most fitting tribute to the Temple women of ancient Babylon, not just understanding what they accomplished, but appreciating how their example continues to demonstrate that human creativity, resilience, and collaborative problem-solving can create possibilities that exceed what any individual could achieve alone, and that the most lasting historical contributions often come from people who figured out how to work within existing systems while gradually transforming them to serve broader human flourishing. Sweet dreams, and thank you for joining this journey through one of history's most fascinating and misunderstood chapters.